Hey, yeah, Oliver, whenever you're ready, go ahead.
Yeah. Okay, I'm going to share my screen. Um, Sorry, can you give me permission to share
Oh,
my
yep.
screen?
Yeah, got you. Hold on. Let me, Oliver. Screw it. I'm making you co-host. There you go.
Okay. All right. So, hi guys, I'm Oliver. I'm not actually in web dev, but I don't know if you know me or not. I've been doing web stuff for probably like 6 or 7 years now, and I'm one of the developers of the Limbrick app, which you may or may not have heard of. I'm also involved in a couple of other things. I have a nonprofit organization to teach programming to mostly middle and elementary schoolers. And I'm also the developer of a Discord bot called Poke2 that started this summer for a replacement of a really popular one called Pokecore that shut down. So I don't know, that's just a brief introduction. Outside of programming, I enjoy, I don't know, I just do a lot of programming. I also like anime and eating food. Right. So today, I'm gonna talk a bit about these modern JavaScript frameworks. So if you've done like any web development within the past couple of years, or like maybe not any, but if you've done a good amount of web development within the last couple of years, you've probably at least heard of these frameworks. Or there's React, which is the one on the left. There's um, Vue.js and then Angular. I don't know why you'd use Angular, but these three frameworks have been really, really like hyped up over the past couple of years. Um, and they're like taking up the web development world by storm. But why? So what exactly do these frameworks offer that are so good that everyone's jumping to use them over like older libraries? And so why exactly are they so popular? So today, to fully understand this, I'm going to first talk about history, these frameworks, and then I'll go into the problem that they solve. So when you asked why these web frameworks are really popular, the really common answers that I get, usually people get, are some of these. First of all, they might be fast. They may or may not be fast. They let you split your UI into components. They have lots of libraries to help you do things. There's a strong community. They're backed by big companies, and they might be easy to learn for beginners or not. And all of these are, I think, these are valid reasons or valid benefits of using these frameworks. But I don't I believe that the fundamental reason that there is one fundamental reason that these frameworks are so popular, and it's not any of these. So we're going to talk about this in a second. But before we talk about that problem, um, it's important to understand a brief history of the World Wide Web and of JavaScript. All right. So originally, the World Wide Web was created by Tim Berners-Lee in 1989, and he was a scientist at CERN. And CERN is like some institution that does like, if you've heard of like particle colliding things, it's like science stuff, right? And the idea is that it's based around hypertext, which was text embedded with links to other hypertext documents. And what he did was he connected hypertext with the internet and created the World Wide Web. And originally, he built this World Wide Web. It was originally intended to like help facilitate automated sharing of information among researchers in universities and science institutes. And that's nothing like what it's actually used for today, right? In today, everything uses the web, um, far more than just researchers in science institutes. So the original web browser shown over here you can see it's just a bunch of green text. And there's no JavaScript, no CSS yet. And that's because it was originally intended just for sharing findings, sharing research information. And so he released the web to the public in 1991. And for the first couple of years, the web was basically just used for its original purpose among certain researchers and institutions. And even so, it wasn't very widely used. But in 1993, CERN opened the World Wide Web for everybody to use and develop for completely free, with no fees whatsoever. And basically, this sparked the interest of some groups to expand the web to be more general purpose. And the development, basically in 1993, that led to the development of several web browsers. So there's one important web browser called Mosaic, and it was basically one of the very first graphical web browsers and Mosaic, the web browser, really, it's not an understatement to basically say that Mosaic directly led to the boom of the web from just 26 websites in 1992 to over 10,000 websites by 1995 and over 1 million by 1998. And thus, the web originally, while not for its original intentions, took off and became super popular. Right. So now here's where JavaScript comes in. So originally, the reason why I talked about the whole history of the web is because I think it's very important to understand that it wasn't created for what it's used for today, right? So in the beginning, there was no way for websites to be interactive. They were just static pages of HTML, and CSS wasn't even a thing yet. So everything just looked however the browser wanted to render it. Well, in 1995, one of the former heads of Mosaic, which is the really popular web browser I talked about on the last slide, he basically decided that the web needed to be more dynamic. And he envisioned this, basically like a scripting language that could power interactive elements like buttons or like form fields. It could power animations and other whatever small automations within the DOM. And yeah, so he envisioned a scripting language like this. So he contracted basically another person in order to design a scripting language. And basically, in the end, what they came up with was JavaScript, which was intended to be a scripting companion to the bigger Java language that was taking off at the time as well. So Java would also be available on the web, but for like heavier applications that need all of those features. But JavaScript was created to be a light way to power interactivity. So with this new language, basically, people were now able to do things like, for example, when the user could like press a button, and after the user presses a button, they would be able to write JavaScript code in order to dynamically do things and update the page while the user presses the button. But there was still a major problem. So basically, originally, okay, so even with JavaScript, at this time, browsers still, or websites still relied on sending complete HTML pages to the client. So in the form of when the user visits a URL, the web server is gonna do some processing. Oh, sorry, I'm not looking at the chat here if someone's saying things.
It's okay, chat's just memeing.
No problem. So when you visit a site, the web server would do some processing and it would send back a complete rendered HTML page. For example, maybe it's like a to-do list or something. But back then, there was still no way to like dynamically make requests to the server. So for example, if you wanted to add a to-do, delete a to-do, or like edit a to-do or something, it would make a completely new request, or it would sort of basically like redirect you to like this different URL that would visit the page, that would again prompt the web server to perhaps do some action and then return back another complete HTML page that has the modified data, right? But since it was like since you're effectively redirecting the user to a completely new URL, basically, while the request is processing, there's really nothing that the user can do on the page without it possibly like being overridden, right? So, and if your internet connection was slow, this could like take a really long time to return the updated results. So that is like a no bueno, right? So in 1997, Internet Explorer invented something called AJAX, which stands for Asynchronous JavaScript and XML. And basically, this would allow browsers to basically, or allow websites to basically write JavaScript code that sends a request in the background. And then instead, for example, if I press the delete button on a to-do in my to-do list, then it'll send a request in the background while my page is like still there, right? And then when that request comes back, instead of sending back a full rendered HTML page, it can just send some new information, right? So maybe the response to that request will be whether that delete was successful or not. And if it's successful, now using JavaScript, instead of having to render a full new page, the JavaScript could just dynamically update the page in order to reflect the new information, right? So with this new AJAX technology, websites were able to be a lot more dynamic, and thus modern websites were born, where the users would be able to dynamically perform actions, see the actions being performed in front of them, and without full page reloads. All right. And now this basically sort of ties in with the actual problem that I'm going to talk about, that these frameworks are trying to solve. So basically, because of the history of HTML and how it was intended to be, JavaScript was later added on as sort of an afterthought. So instead of like powering the HTML, like powering the UI, JavaScript would be able to just imperatively change the UI, right? So it would look something like this. So this is just a simple example of some code. For example, going back to the to-do list, right? So maybe we have an array of items over here, and maybe, so, okay, so this is just, wait, how do I annotate? All right, so the idea is that on the page, you first render some HTML that might be like, the first HTML you render, since there's no to-do list, it's going to be like an empty div, right? Or an empty container, right? And so you don't have to write any UI markup in here because you don't want to render any to-dos when the to-do list is still empty. But basically what you want to do is when the user adds a to-do, you make a request to the server, and then you also add the to-do into this your local state. But then in order to update the UI to show the user the new to-do, you create some new elements and then just dynamically append them to the DOM, right? So then you end up with like something like this. And this is dynamically updated via JavaScript. And, oh yeah, ignore that. Okay. And this might seem like it works pretty well, but the problem is, with this sort of model, anytime we make a change to the state, we have to completely, or anytime we make a change to the state, we have to make a change to the UI as well, right? To reflect the changes in the state. And that's not always an easy task. You can see here that it only takes like 2 or 3 lines of code to update the state, but then now we have like 10 lines of code in order to update the UI. Since it's kind of hard to do that in JavaScript. And in addition to making it super hard to write code to update the UI, our UI code is now in 2 places, and it's super prone to error. right? So this is obviously a really, really simple example, but you could already see perhaps something happening like somewhere in between here or here if you're doing some extra things. It's what if this part of the code succeeds and a new to-do is made on the server and add to the database, and it's also reflected in this items array, but somewhere over here, this fails. So the UI fails to be updated. So now the UI and the state are out of sync, right? That seems slightly unlikely in this very, very simple example. But when you have massive, complex applications of lots of moving parts, it's super hard to keep the UI in sync with the state. And any small mistake in our code can lead to issues where the user thinks something happened or the user thinks nothing happened. But in reality, something did happen, but it just never got reflected on the UI. So keeping the UI in sync with the state is hard, basically. So what's the solution, right? If we can't write imperative code in order to update our UI whenever a state changes, how are we going to do that? So think for a second. So what if we could, instead of writing code to always update our UI every time the state changes, what if we could just write code to declare what the UI is in terms of the state, right? So for example, some pseudocode here, right? So if we could write, for example, a for loop inside our HTML, and for each item, we render this, right? If there were some way to let us do this, then this would basically solve our entire problem. We don't need to worry about updating our UI anytime the state changes if the UI code is just based on the state code. So when we add a new item, all we have to do is push it to this items array. If we want to delete item, all we have to do is delete it from the items array. And now we won't really have to worry about like things not being in sync, right? So essentially, this is what we call like declarative UI markup or declarative code, where we declare what things should look like instead of compared to imperative, where we go over here and like we imperatively change the UI anytime the state changes. And essentially, it's the most important thing that these frameworks let us do, React, Vue, and Angular that I talked about at the beginning, is to offer a way to write declarative code, which wasn't possible with vanilla JavaScript just because vanilla JavaScript was just pretty much an afterthought after HTML. And okay, this is just some pseudocode, but if you look some more examples of like actual React code here, so we can see that if you look at this part, if we just have a variable called loading, and if it's loading, if the page is loading, then we can display something, and if it's not loading, we can display something else, right? If this may not seem really, really special, but being able to declare our UI in terms of some application state makes it so we don't have to go and anytime we perform an operation, we don't have to write code to delete this from the DOM and then add this to the DOM, etc. And it just makes it a lot easier to write our application. All right. So basically, the summary is, if you go around and you find people and you talk to them about React or Vue or something, and they tell you that, oh, I really like this because it lets me make components, or like there's a lot of libraries, just remember that these problems over here are not what these frameworks fundamentally are trying to solve, right? Obviously, these have some benefits, right? Like being able to split your UI into components is definitely a real benefit, but it's not exactly unique to these frameworks. There's been components on the web for a really long time. Components have existed for a really long time, but having components doesn't necessarily solve the problem that these frameworks are trying to solve, which is just that keeping the UI in sync with the state is hard. And so basically, the next time someone tells you that this is the reason why this framework is so popular, oh, you can correct them and then tell them, oh, that's not why. It's because declarative code. So yeah, that's pretty much what I want to talk about. I hope that was a little interesting, or like give you a little insight into why these frameworks are used. And I think it also tells you, or it also helps you decide when to not use these frameworks, right? If all you're doing is making a static website and there's no application state, then maybe you don't need to use one of these frameworks. Because the main benefits of being able to sync the UI with the state don't really matter if you don't have a state at all. So yeah. Do you guys have any like questions? Would you
Ronak
use
wants
the
to know if you would. Oh, who was speaking? Was Ronak talking? Or what? Okay, so he's asking, would you use a framework for making an extension?
For making an extension, like a browser extension? Well, browser extensions are kind of complicated things because I recall how Chrome extensions work is that you can have, so this pop-up here, for example, if I click this extension, this pop-up here is not the only part of the extension. This is only a small part of the extension. There's a lot of scripts going around in the background and doing things. So I think ultimately it depends. If you're making a browser extension, it really, it depends on like how complicated your thing is going to be. If you're just making a browser extension that like, I don't know, turns your website like into dark mode or light mode, then maybe you don't need one if it's just one single toggle. But if you have like a lot, oh yeah, that actually works pretty well. But if you have like a lot of things over here, I don't really see a downside to using a framework if you think it's complicated enough I think if it's complicated enough where you think that it would be easier to use a framework, then just go for it, I think. I would really, for a browser extension, I would really recommend Vue.js over React, because you can basically just add a script tag into a regular HTML page and it's really light. So yeah, why not? I don't see any reason to not do it if it's complicated enough. Regex filter to YouTube chat. Okay, well, if your browser extension is injecting things on the web page, then you probably shouldn't use one there. But I meant in the pop-up, you could use a Vue.js. Download size of Vue. Vue isn't very big. I think it's only like, I don't know, is it like 20 kilobytes? I don't.
33 kilobytes. I just looked at.
Yeah, close enough. Yeah, Vue isn't that big. If your thing is good enough, or if you have enough like toggles and like form fields or things in a pop-up, then yeah, sure, you can use Vue.js. Why not? Anything else?
Yeah, if you got questions, put it in the chat or just ask with your mic. Ronak asks, how do I delete a JS framework? I think he's talking about Angular.
Okay, on Angular. Yeah, don't use it. Don't use Angular. You can use React or Vue, or you could even not use a JS framework, but don't use Angular. Okay, if you want an actual explanation for why I don't like Angular, it's like pretty off topic for, I mean, obviously Angular does let you write reactive code or like declarative code, but I think it's super annoying because like Angular is like really large, and then it makes you make like a ton of files. So if you want to make a single component, you basically need to make 3 files in Angular, and that is, to me, that's really annoying. Whereas in React, I can basically have 10 components in the same file. So my opinion on Flutter. I think Flutter is cool. So the Limbrick app was made with React Native, and React Native is sort of similar to Flutter, but okay. Flutter, I believe Flutter, okay, in both React Native and Flutter, the UI code gets compiled into basically native. But in React Native, you still have a JavaScript layer going on there. But in Flutter, all the code gets compiled completely to native code. When you write, I think it's written in Dart, right? You write Dart. So I think Flutter is cool because, yeah, everything goes completely to native code, which should mean that your application could run faster than a React Native application would. I haven't used Flutter myself, but coming from a React Native person, I think Flutter looks cool.
Okay, I'm gonna guess we have no more questions.
Yeah, I'm gonna post the sign-in link in the chat, and yeah, the code is. What do you guys want to make the code today?
Oliver.
Yeah, let's just make it all over. Let's go.
Oh, okay, okay.
Sign-in code is Oliver today.
Oh,
Thanks so much. Great presentation.
yeah, that was good.
Yay!
That's a
Yeah.
great
Actually
presentation,
start
Oliver.
using-
I loved it.
I might start using Vue now.
Yeah, if you actually want to do a comparison of React, the different, or of React and Vue specifically, I think Vue is like, I like Vue for small applications or like small pages, because you can basically just include Vue as a script tag, and you don't need Webpack, you don't need a bundler, you don't need Babel, you don't need anything like that. You just include it as a script tag, and then everything works. So that means if you have a page that's using vanilla JS, you can convert it to use Vue really, really easily. And not having Webpack means it just feels that much lighter.
True.
Yeah, you don't need like a ton of files and everything. But I think for bigger projects, I prefer React over Vue, because in React, I can make like 10 components in a single file. Whereas in Vue uses single file components. I mean, I guess that sort of comes down to personal preference, but I don't like having a ton of files in my project.
All right. Well, I'm gonna end the recording here. So bye, YouTube. Bye. Bye.
Damn.